I asked you very candidly to come on the podcast. And I said, what is coming up for? What do you feel so passionate about right now in the container of health and wellness? What's really driving you and keeping you very curious? And you told me glucose, Freddie. Glucose has got me curious. So why
Mm.
glucose, Lauren?
For so many reasons, but that's when I'm essentially spending my days and nights and weekends looking at, thinking about, talking to people about. Most of my clientele comes to me because they are curious about continuous glucose monitoring. So a lot of people are kind of turned on to the fact that diabetes, it doesn't exist in a silo. It exists on a spectrum. Our glucose functioning, our metabolic health, you could be metabolic syndrome one end of the spectrum, but we don't become diabetic tomorrow, right? It's not a light switch. It's not one day off, the next day on. So people are getting turned on to this idea that the spectrum is really important. That's really what prevention medicine is. And so it's interesting why people come into glucose. Some of it is just biohackers. They're like, this is the next tool. I have to, check it off the list, figure it out, explore it for myself, which is awesome. Some people are coming into it because they have a family history of diabetes. Some people want weight loss. And then I think there's kind of this unexplored option that people are starting to look at more and more is how can we just use this tool as a window into our physiology for a multitude of root causes, factors, diseases, experiences that we're having in life. Really, like, there are so many things under that umbrella: mental health, neurodegeneration, depression, anxiety. How do we adapt to toxins in the environment? So, toxic exposures, chemicals, molds, mycotoxins, the air we breathe, the water we drink, right? That's a very long list that your listeners are familiar with.
Yeah.
Um, Inflammation at large, also emotions, trauma, isolation, social isolation. This all comes up in the context of glucose because glucose is a way that our cells are responding and adapting to the environment. So to circle back, the CGM actually is a window into how are you handling your stress, whether it
Yeah.
be mental, physical, emotional. How are you handling these toxins that are pervasive in our environment and getting worse and worse every year? Not to scare people. I'm not here to be an alarmist, but we have a lot of opportunities here.
Yeah. Can I ask you just for a bird's eye view, what is like a level 1 and level 2 of glucose mismanagement look like? When people say I'm insulin sensitive or I am type 2 diabetes, type 1, can you give a little bird's eye explainer so we can put those in separate categories?
On paper, it would look like going to your physician for your annual lab work, hopefully biannual. You want to get it every 6 months because our physiology is always changing. We could have markers in the pre or diabetic range. So looking at HbA1c, which is an average marker of glucose, 3 to 4 months average. You could look at fasting glucose, which I want to say is not super valuable because you're going into a doctor's office getting blood drawn. We have a lot of white coat syndrome where cortisol rises. It's not your normal environment. People may be fasting longer or less than the time that they normally do. We can measure insulin, which is the hormone that is responsible for this whole reaction in the body. And then we can look at all the metabolic markers. So from a numeric perspective or diagnostic perspective, we can put people into categories based on numbers. The other bird's eye view is how are you feeling? And this is the part that people don't really know. Diabetics don't necessarily feel that they're heading towards diabetes. And a lot of my clients come to me, and when they're having these glucose excursions, and we could talk about what is optimal, what is ideal. I don't know that we have a lot of long-term research on what it should look like in a healthy individual, but we have some ideas just based off of the evidence and research that we do have. But I find that's a huge missing piece. Not everyone feels when they're either hyper or hypoglycemic. So traditionally, we're really going off of labs and numbers to be diagnosed or put into a category or to say, hey, you really need to start paying attention to this. So bird's eye view is we use numbers on labs, and the CGM also gives us numerical feedback. And the big missing opportunity is then using it as a tool like we do with any of our data wearables. What does this number mean subjectively? How do I feel when the objective data says this? Can I feel it in my body? And that's a huge gap. People don't feel that they have high blood sugar, which is why we end up pre-diabetic, diabetic.
Hmm. It's fascinating. Can you also just, again, for the audience really quickly, what is the difference between hyper and hypoglycemia?
Yeah, hyper would be above the normal expected range.
Hmm.
For example, you eat pizza. That one's fun. Everyone's like, shoot, how do I include pizza into a healthy, normal diet? It all has to do with your baseline. So, fasting glucose. So, say my fasting glucose is 85. It all depends on the excursion from the 85. So, say I'm at 85, I eat some pizza and I spike to 185. That would be hyperglycemia. That is beyond the normal expected range for a healthy glucose response. Of course, it's more nuanced than that because it depends how long are you staying up there, how quickly do you
Right.
come back down. Do you then go lower than your baseline and rebound? And that's when we start to feel fatigue, brain fog, digestive upset, all kinds of things, irritability, depression, anxiety. Hypoglycemia would be below your normal expected baseline. And we could have reactive hypoglycemia to foods. So, particular foods, if you're not eating the right macronutrient composition, protein, fat, carbohydrates, could also be a factor of things in your environment, water, air, dehydration. That list goes on. And then there's just standard hypoglycemia where you just tend to run a little bit lower. You could think of this as like your low energy people, like low cellular energy, vibrating at a very just kind of low frequency. Sometimes
Mm.
also shows up as hypo, so under. Hypo would be low, hyper would be high.